My name is Bolongu Amani. I am 29 years old. I come from a small village in Zimbabwe, a place where life was simple yet unforgiving. Today I share my story. Not just any story, but one buried deep within me, hidden like a shard of glass beneath scarred skin. Until now, no one has ever heard these words. But today, I share this story with the world. The world must know what happened during my 5 years as a slave in Mr. Arnold Dan's mansion. At age 9, I was sold for $50, 50 American dollars. My own mother handed me over to a stranger who came to our village one humid afternoon. She needed money for my younger brother's education. And so, I became a commodity, a thing to be bartered, bought and owned. The man who purchased me was named Mr. Arnold. He forbade anyone from speaking his full name aloud, though he never explained why. On the day he arrived at my village, he wore a long black coat that dragged through the dust and a weathered hat, pulled low over his face. His appearance was frightening. His pale skin seemed almost translucent under the African sun. His sharp jawline gave him the appearance of something carved from stone. And his eyes? It frightened me the most. They were grey, cold and empty, like storm clouds before the rain. There was nothing human about them. No welcome, no warmth, just emptiness. Mr. Arnold was 40 when he took me from my home. A lonely man with no family, no friends. Only 4 massive dogs that he cherished more than anything else in the world. For 10 years, I lived as a ghost in his sprawling mansion, invisible yet trapped within its walls. My existence was defined by silence. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not meet his gaze. Do not question, obey. For a decade, I faded into the background, blending seamlessly with the shadows. But everything changed when I turned 20. That year, my body began to betray me. My titties suddenly began to develop rapidly, so much that it could no longer be hidden under my frail old white gown. My hips widened and my curves grew pronounced. That was when Mr. Arnold first began to notice me. Suddenly, I was no longer invisible, and that was when it all began. One afternoon, as I dusted his bedroom, I felt his stare burning into me. Master sat in his usual spot near the window, pretending to read a magazine about dogs. Or perhaps he really was reading it. I'll never know. What I do know is that his eyes roamed freely across my figure, tracing every line of my form as I bent to fluff his pillows. The air thickened, charged with an unfamiliar tension. As a 20-year-old virgin, I had no idea what this feeling was. When I finished making the bed, I moved to the center table laying right in front of Mr. Arnold to polish a small flower vase. This time, I could feel his gaze fixate on my chest, as my huge melons dangled left and right under my old cotton gown in front of him. My old gown hung loosely on my frame, but it couldn't hide the changes in my body. I hadn't worn a bra since arriving at the mansion. It wasn't something slaves were given, and my melons swung freely as I worked. Then, his voice shattered the silence. Hoarse and commanding, it startled me. It was the first time Master had ever addressed me directly. "Come here," he said. I froze, unsure if I'd imagined the words. Slowly, I raised my head, but I couldn't bring myself to look at his face. To me, Mr. Arnold was untouchable. He was like a god whose presence demanded submission. Bowing my head again, I obeyed. I set down the rag and hurried to his side, standing before him. He didn't say another word. Instead, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Before I could react, his hand shot out, slipping beneath the fabric of my gown. Master slid his hand into my chest. He grabbed one of my melons. He squeezed it. His grip was firm. Then he moved to the left one, squeezing it tightly with his hand, as though he was testing its firmness. I stood there, rigid, unable to breathe, let alone protest. Protest? I dared not. His touch was clinical, detached, and yet somewhat approving. When he finally withdrew his hand, he smiled, a thin, satisfied smirk, and said, "You're ripe." His words sent a chill racing down my spine. What was Master talking about? What was I ripe for? "Follow me," he ordered, turning toward the door. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I followed silently, trailing behind Mr. Arnold like a dog on a leash. We walked to the back of the house, where a small wooden cottage stood apart from the main mansion. This was where the dogs lived. In all my years at the mansion, I had never been inside their quarters. The building smelled faintly of wet fur and earth. But something shocking happened the moment I stepped inside. The dogs erupted into frenzied excitement. They leapt toward me, their tongues lashing out hungrily. They began to lick my hands, my legs, and my behind. I froze, overwhelmed by confusion and disgust. Was this normal? Did dogs behave this way? Why were they licking my behind? I wanted to ask, but the words died in my throat due to fear. So, I stood there, frozen, as the animals sniffed and pawed at me, their tails wagging wildly. "Sit, Jake. Sit, Jamie. All of you sit." Mr. Arnold barked suddenly. The 4 huge dogs immediately obeyed, sitting down but wagging their tails, excitedly as though Master had walked in holding a piece of meat. Turning to me, Mr. Arnold said, "This is your new job now. You will take care of the dogs and meet their physical and emotional needs." I nodded, still shaken from the frenzy the dogs had displayed earlier. I hadn't given his words much thought at the time. Mr. Arnold ushered me out of the small cottage and instructed me to go clean myself up. I wondered why he was making such a request. He had never asked these things before, but I obeyed without question. Master stopped me from doing any more chores that day. Today might be the best day of my life, I thought to myself as I walked back to my tiny room. I cleaned myself up and waited as Master had instructed. That night, I was summoned to his bedroom. When I entered, the room felt different. The reason? All 4 of Mr. Arnold's dogs were there with him. "Take it off," Mr. Arnold commanded immediately. I knew what he meant. I didn't complain. I dared not. I removed my usual old worn-out gown. Beneath it, I was bare. Mr. Arnold said nothing. He simply stared at me, standing before him with my head bowed. His eyes gleamed brightly as they roamed over my body. They lingered on my 2 huge melons, standing firm on my chest like the walls of Jericho. Then they drifted lower. He looked at me down there, and I just stood there, frozen. Shame washed over me. It was the first time I had exposed myself to a man. But it wasn't only Mr. Arnold's gaze that made me feel as though the floor should swallow me whole. It was something else, something surprising. It was how Jake and the other dogs panted restlessly, watching me with an intensity I couldn't comprehend. Mr. Arnold gestured toward the bed. I followed his command, trembling. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest, I feared it could be heard across the hall. What was Master going to do to me? Mr. Arnold walked to his drawer and retrieved a small jar of honey. Then he returned to me, now lying bare on the bed. He smiled, an eerie grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "Don't be scared," he said with a smirk. His voice was deep and hoarse. I held my breath. For the first time in years, words escaped my lips. "What are you going to do to me, Master?" I stammered, shaking. Mr. Arnold said nothing. The 4 dogs remained at a distance, standing silently and watching us intently, as though observing a scene unfold. Waiting for something. Mr. Arnold climbed onto the bed and knelt beside me. He poured some honey into his hands from the jar he'd retrieved. Then, leaning close, he whispered softly, "Spread them." I didn't question him. I did as I was told. I held my breath so tightly, I thought I might suffocate. My heart raced so fiercely it felt like it would burst through my chest. Seeing my tension, Mr. Arnold placed his left hand on one of my melons. He began to massage it gently. Then, he whispered in my ear, "Be calm. You'll like it." I don't know why, but the sensation of his fingers squeezing my melon sent another shiver coursing through me. I turned my head away, unable to look at Master's face. But he didn't stop. If anything, he seemed to enjoy himself even more. His thumb found its way to the pointy thing on my melon, throbbing, rubbing, and pulling it firmly. By now it was hard, and I was lost in sensations I had never experienced before. The feelings overwhelmed me. Too much pain. Too much pleasure. For a slave girl like me. I pressed my lips together tightly, trying to suppress the moans threatening to escape. Mr. Arnold moved methodically, switching between my titties, gliding his hands over every inch of my skin. I lay frozen, unable to resist. Then he paused, pouring more honey into his hands. Then his fingers moved lower, to down there. I was already spread open, just as he had commanded earlier. There was a pause. "You're quite hairy," Mr. Arnold murmured, looking at me, his expression intense. Then he began rubbing his honey-covered fingers all around it, gliding them softly, yet deliberately. At this point I froze. Strange sounds suddenly began escaping my mouth, noises I didn't know I was capable of making. I no longer knew where I was or who I was. I parted it wider instinctively, giving him better access. Master noticed and seemed pleased by my reaction. More honey, more caressing. I closed my eyes, surrendering completely to the electric rush of sensations coursing through me. When he withdrew his hand, I impulsively reached out and pulled it back. Master looked at me with mild surprise. Even I was shocked by what I had just done. And then, that was when it happened. Mr. Arnold snapped his fingers at the dogs. They rushed toward us eagerly. My eyes flew open, panic surging within me. I wanted to scream, but Master cupped his hand firmly over my mouth, silencing me. "She," he whispered, placing a finger to his lips, signaling for me to stay quiet. I didn't move. I couldn't fight. I was his slave, and he could do whatever he wanted with me, including this. I watched helplessly as Jake and the others approached, panting hungrily, as if ready to tear me apart. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the worst. Then, I felt it. Something cool and slippery slid inside me. My entire body stiffened. It was a tongue. Opening my eyes, I saw Jake's head buried between my downmare, licking it furiously. His movements caused violent tremors to ripple through my legs. My legs began to shake. I gave in entirely. Mr. Arnold removed his hand from my mouth, staring at me intently as my body relaxed and I moaned shamelessly. It was wild. He stroked himself as his dogs took turns on it. And he watched. He kept pouring more honey onto me, and the dogs licked it all off with their tongues. First Jake, then the others followed, one by one. Then two of them worked together. This spectacle seemed to excite Mr. Arnold immensely. Soon, he began making noises similar to mine, as he stroked himself harder as he watched. The sheets beneath me were soaking wet. Mr. Arnold and his dogs had taken me to a place I never imagined I could reach. It was over. Still bare, I rose unsteadily and approached my master, now sitting on his chair. The only words I could muster were, "Thank you, sir," as I bent my knees slightly in an old village gesture of respect. Mr. Arnold smiled. "Get dressed," he said. "We'll be doing this from now on." I nodded shyly, bowing my head. He granted me permission to dress, and I quickly gathered my gown and hurried out of the room. A whirlwind of emotions swirled in my mind. Master had shown me something I had never known existed. And at that moment, I wished he had gone further. I hoped someday he would, allowing me to experience the full intensity of a man's power and what he could do with my body. Maybe then he would love me. Maybe I could become more than just his slave girl. But whatever he chose, however far he was willing to go, even with his dogs, I was ready. I was ready for him. If this was what paradise felt like, I wanted to stay here forever. I vowed never to complain again, never to question him. He was my master, and I was his slave. And this slave, I wanted to remain for the rest of my life. For 5 years, our strange romance continued. 5 years during which I became his slave, not just in service but in every intimate way imaginable. Those years were filled with moments both painful and pleasurable. Yet through it all, I found a twisted kind of solace. It was wrong, so very wrong. But within those walls, under his gaze, I felt seen. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen me. Not as an object, not as a commodity, but as something more. Even if that something more came wrapped in chains. Everything seemed fine. But then, one fateful day, Master sent me away. "I'm setting you free," he said softly, almost regretfully. "You're a bird meant to soar beyond these walls." I begged him to reconsider. How could he send me away when I wanted nothing more than to stay? To serve him, to belong to him. For the rest of my life. I didn't want freedom. I craved captivity. "No," he replied firmly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of sadness. "You must go out there and experience the world. You deserve a life outside of this house." On the day of my departure, Master handed me a check for $2 million and told me he'd set up a small clothing line in my name. A gift, he called it. And just like that, I was gone. Gone from the mansion, from the dogs, from him. He disappeared into another city, starting anew, perhaps seeking a fresh face, a new prodigy to mold. As for me, I was left shattered, heartbroken. I had loved him, deeply, desperately, and now I was cast aside like yesterday's memory. But even in my anguish, I obeyed, because that is what I did best, follow his commands. In the years that followed, I built a new life. Today, I live comfortably in the States, running the clothing line he gifted me. My days are filled with meetings, designs, and dreams I once thought impossible. No one knows my past, the village I came from, the price tag placed on my childhood, or the forbidden love story that shaped me. From a black slave girl to a business owner, my transformation is one few would believe. Yet beneath the polished surface lies a heart still tethered to the past. A heart that misses him, the man who saved me, in every way that a person can be saved. Saved me from poverty, from invisibility, from a life without purpose. Yes, he took things from me too. My innocence, my dignity. But in return, he gave me tools to rebuild myself. Tools I never asked for but needed nonetheless. Sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the weight of my memories presses down on me, I wonder about him. Does he think of me? Does he remember the girl who worshipped him, feared him, and loved him? Or have I faded from his mind entirely, replaced by someone newer, younger, brighter? I wonder. Despite losing him, today, I live the life most could only dream of. Living financially free. Though his absence breaks my heart, Mr. Arnold Dan left me with a crucial lesson. Life has a peculiar way of turning pain into blessings, scars into strength. And though I wouldn't have chosen this path if given the chance, I cannot deny where it has led me. To this day, tears well in my eyes whenever I allow myself to think of him. Not because of what he took, but because of what he gave. He changed me, forever. And though I'll never see him again, though our paths will never cross in this lifetime, I carry him with me always. In the fabric of my clothes, in the echoes of my success, in the depths of my soul. Thank you, Mr. Arnold Dern. Thank you for saving me, for breaking me, for making me whole again. Even if no one else understands, I know the truth. You were both my captor and my liberator, my curse and my redemption. So I say thank you to the man who changed my life forever. My name is Bolongu Amani, and this is my story. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this type of content and want to get more true life anonymous stories like this, please support the channel by subscribing. Leave a like and share your thoughts with us. Don't forget to stay wet as there's more to come.